Good evening, and welcome to our Historical Sketches show. Now, talking about Ukraine may be controversial these days, which proves what I said in the first episode of this series. Actually, not what I said, but what the philosopher Nietzsche said of historical facts, namely that there are no facts, but only interpretations, which, by the way, is one reason why history is continually being rewritten, even after hundreds of years from the occurrence of the event that the history purportedly describes. This is not because the facts of that history have changed. They have not changed, but their interpreters have, and they, meaning the interpreters, judge or interpret those events from the point of view of the present, or rather, from their point of view of the present. And this constant rewriting of history tends to acquire often an openly Orwellian overtone in some instances. Take the case of the tragic downing of Malaysian flight MH117. And the flourish of accusations by the Western media that Russia did it. Weeks go by and a stony silence drops on the event, almost as if all had never been, as Shakespeare would say. Until, most recently, with fanfare, pomp and circumstance, the investigative panel told the world what the world already knew, that the aircraft was shot at and brought down by gunfire. Not only, but unreported by the Western regime media, on the 12th of August of 2014, the official Ukrainian news agency published its bulletin, as you see in the image, and the translated title says, "The investigations of the accident of the Boeing will be announced at an agreement of sides." Now, the title is somewhat opaque, but the subtitle is illuminating. And it reads, it reads, "Within the limits of the quadrilateral agreement signed on August the 8th between Ukraine, the Netherlands, Belgium and Australia, the information on the investigation of accident Boeing 777 will not be disclosed." Now, Shakespeare would say, "By the salt wave of the Mediterranean, this is incredible. What is there to deserve secrecy when almost 300 people are killed and you don't tell us why?" It is almost, as Nietzsche said, it is almost as if the facts did not happen, because their cause is now kept secret so that we cannot interpret it. Which reminds me of what Dr. Johnson said on the subject. "Truth is scarcely to be heard but by those from whom it can serve no interest to conceal it." Now, this show, Historical Sketches that is, does not habitually deal with contemporary history, but rather with its antecedents. It was indeed the great Greek historian Themistocles, who said that to understand a historical event, we must know its antecedents. And in the case of Ukraine, the antecedents bring us back more than 1,000 years. And they have to do, you may have guessed it perhaps, with religion. Specifically, I refer to the Great Schism of 1054 AD, when the Greek Orthodox Church, with her patriarch, separated itself from the Church of Rome with her Pope. In fact, if we were to pay strict adherence to the meaning of words as a historian pointed out, the Roman Catholic Church is neither Roman nor Catholic. And why? Because Catholic is a Greek word meaning universal, and certainly Catholics do not represent the universality of Christianity, which includes, of course, Protestants and Orthodox and a few other denominations. And how about the Roman in Roman Catholic? That is not accurate either. The Roman Empire under Emperor Diocletian was split into Eastern Roman Empire and centered in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, and into the Western Roman Empire, still centered in Rome. But the Western Roman Empire collapsed, as you know, in the 5th century AD, and therefore the only Roman Empire surviving was in the East, as I said, in Constantinople. A more accurate term for the Roman Catholic Church would be maybe the Papist Church. But the term papist or papist is laden with negative connotations. And the negativity, if you like, arose at the time of Luther's Reformation, and at the time of the creation of the Church of England with Henry VIII in the 1500 and so forth. And also later from the English Civil War of the 1600, when to be a papist or to be popish was tantamount to being an associate of the devil. A historian has suggested that the better name for the Roman Catholic Church will be the Frankist Church, as it was indeed Charlemagne, as we saw in episode number 8, who resurrected the Roman Empire, calling it holy. Which some would probably agree, I mean, to call it holy is a bit of a stretch of the imagination. But if we called the Roman Catholic Church like the Frankist Church, if we called it the Frankist Church, nobody would understand it. Even though, to be accurate, the Arabs, for example, they called the Papist Franks and the Orthodox Romans, and they still do now in Arabic. So you see, there has been an understanding of what was going on 1,000 years ago or thereabouts. Still, sacrificing lexical accuracy for convenience to convenience, let's stick with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the Roman Catholic Church claims to be the original Christian church, which again, looking at the facts, is not true, or at least it was not held to be true by the time when those who rebelled during the Great Schism of 1054, when there arose respectively the Eastern and the Western Christian churches, today known as the Orthodox and as the Roman or the Catholic Church. But why the schism? Because what we know now, as I said, the Catholic Church introduced a number of dogmas which, according to the Orthodox, contradicted the original Christian faith. And these dogmas kept coming until recently, historically recent times. For example, the dogmas of the Immaculate Conception and of the infallibility of the Pope were introduced during the second part of the 19th century by Pope Pius IX. But there were other reasons too. Now, the word Catholic, as I said before, means both universal and conciliar, meaning it meant that prior to the schism, the highest authority of the Church resided in the Church councils, especially the so-called ecumenical councils. But the Papists, the Roman Catholics that is, they transferred the authority of the councils to one man and one man only, namely the Pope. And from this point of view, the Orthodox Church considered the Papist, the Roman Catholic, as heretical, because having abandoned the tradition of the ancient Church and the Church of the Fathers. Besides besides this concentration of power in the Pope, there were also other innovations held to be in direct contradiction with the teaching of Christ and of his apostles. According to the Orthodox, the main heresy of the Catholic Church is the very notion of the Pope and the iron determination that all Christianity should submit to his authority. This objective of papal supremacy was sealed by a document introduced a mere 20 years later after the Great Schism of 1054 AD, and it was called the Dictatus Papae, the dictate of the Pope, where dictates has the same lexical root as dictatorial, meaning I say so because it is so, and get out of my way if you object. A long preamble you may say, but these details are important, I think, to understand what happened afterwards, including to an extent what happened and happens today in Ukraine. Still, we have some time to travel between 1054, the year of the Schism, and today. Now, in the previous episode number 8, we have already encountered Pope Innocent III. It was he who supported King Philip Augustus of France against the English antagonists, King John Lackland and the German Emperor Otto IV. And it was the same Pope, Innocent III, who launched the most peculiar crusade of all, the Fourth Crusade, that is, which occurred between the year 1202 and 1204 AD. But why peculiar? Let us see. Most people assume that the Crusades were directed against Islam to free the city of Jerusalem from the so-called Muslim infidels. But this is not true. Just like today with the war on terror, the conquest of Jerusalem was not the real, or at least was not the only objective. The other objective was to exterminate, or at least to convert, the Greek schismatics, as they call them, meaning the Orthodox Christians. Now, the apex, the pinnacle of this anti-Orthodox crusade was the sack of Constantinople by the Crusader in the year 1204 AD, during which the city was subjected to 3 days of absolutely grotesque pillaging, looting and massacres by the Western Christians, who ransacked and burned down Orthodox churches, monasteries and convents, and they raped nuns on church altars and even placed a prostitute on the patriarchal throne, a kind of Christian Isil before its time, we could say. Except that rather than Islamic, the state imposed by the Crusader was now Catholic. This outpouring of genocidal hatred in Constantinople was not the exception. It was one of the earlier externation of something which would formally assume the name of Inquisition, an official body assigned to burn, destroy, torture and kill whoever happened to be found heretical or in odor of heresy, words still used today that come directly from the canons. There is, however, another very important event, or fact if you like, in the history of the Latin hatred for the Orthodox Church, which is far less known. And it happened 150 years later after the Schism in 1242. The successor to Innocent III was Gregory IX, promoter of what can be called the Northern Crusades. Gregory IX, by the way, is the official father of the Papal Inquisition, though long before heretics, were burned with zeal when the Western Church found them to be in opposition to their tenets in their territory. Pope Gregory IX changed the direction of the crusade. Today we would call it a diversification. He wanted to convert the pagans of the north and of Eastern Europe to the true faith, which was, of course, his faith, the faith of Gregory IX. Today the true faith would be called neoconservative liberalism, except that the next crusade may, or well, hopefully will not be, World War III. Now, for Gregory IX, Orthodox Russia was pagan land, and Orthodox Christians were pagans too. And so he ordered the Teutonic Knights, which were valiant successors of the Franks, whom we saw in preceding episodes. He ordered the Teutonic Knights to convert or kill all the pagans that they would meet on their way. And an echo of this mindset, if you like, we were to find in recent historical history during World War II, when the purported Catholic, Croatian and Nazi ally leader by the name of Ante Pavelić gave similar orders against the Serbs: convert, kill or expel. Expel those who can run away anyway. But this time, however, the time of Pope Gregory IX, the forces of Pope Gregory IX found an unexpected and formidable defender, the Russian Prince Alexander Nevsky, whom the Orthodox Church has made a saint of. Now, before meeting the Pope's crusader in battle, Alexander Nevsky had already repelled an invasion of Russia by the West, the attempt to invade northern Russia by the Swedish kingdom, which he defeated in 1240 at the famous Battle of the Neva. But at the same time, Alexander Nevsky had been unable to defeat the Mongols or Tartars invading from the east. And so he was faced with a choice, if you like, a conflict of civilizations. He could not fight the Pope and the Mongols or the Tartars, the name is interchangeable. He could not fight them at the same time. And there were not many options really, that is, to submit to one and to resist the other. But which one should we choose to submit Russia to? Prince Alexander knew pretty well the policies of his enemies. As far as they were concerned, the Tartars wanted to extract taxes from the Russians, but they did not want to convert anybody or to persecute the established church. On the contrary, the savage Mongols respected the church and its clergy, and they never persecuted the faithful. In fact, the Mongols were mostly assimilated with the local population, and this is why you often see Russians with features that we could call Northern Orientals, including Putin if you look at his eyes. In contrast, the Northern Crusaders were given the specific order to convert or murder all the Orthodox Christians they could encounter. Consequently, Prince Alexander Nevsky chose to submit to the Mongol Khan, the Mongol king, and to fight the Crusaders, whom he defeated at the famous Battle of the Ice in 1242. The battle was fought on Lake Peipus and was called Battle of the Ice because, before global warming, on the day of the battle, which was April the 5th, 1242, the lake was still frozen. After this defeat, the Pope and the Western elites halted temporarily their converting, if you like, their expansionistic ambitions. They halted them, but they did not stop them. And the next wave of invasions occurred in the 14th century. And incidentally, on the 24th of August 2014, Alexander Zakarchenko took the oath as Prime Minister of the Donetsk People's Republic, now in eastern Ukraine, and in his inaugural speech he made reference to history. In that he said, the Western powers every 50 years or so try to conquer the East and the Eastern Orthodox. Now 50 years may be an approximation, but the concept is accurate. In a chapter attached to his famous War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy describes the wave of invasions or attempted invasions of the East by the West. And it is true that, for example, after about 100 years went by after Napoleon's invasion of 1812, before the Germans tried to invade Russia in World War I, And after that, it took a little more than 20 years before the Germans tried again with Hitler in World War II. But the concept, the idea of the recurring attempts at invasion, the concept remains. Go back to the past. The next wave of invasions began in the early 1300 and lasted about 1385, when the Union of Craiova determined the conglomeration of what was then Poland with what was then Lithuanian territories that included most of what today we call Ukraine, finally. And then, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Turks, marking the end of the Eastern Roman Empire and the end of the Roman civilization. And as you know, the Western Roman Empire had officially fallen, as I said before, 1,000 years in 476 AD. At this point, Moscow became the Third Rome, the last free Orthodox Christian kingdom, the heir to the Roman civilization. Moscow would now become the focal point of the papist hatred for Orthodox Christianity. And the next Western strike would come in 1595, about 200 years later, and it would be a truly devastating one. This time, the president, or rather the Pope, was Clement VIII, and it was he who forged the idea of Ukraine. And by the way, the etymology of the term Ukraine means borderlands, and indicated various regions bordering what was then called Rus and today Russia. By the end of the 16th century, most of the Western Russia had been occupied by the Roman Catholic for about 200 years, 1400 to 1600. The situation of the Orthodox Christians, peasants under the Catholic occupation was appalling. The population was essentially enslaved by the aristocracy of what we could call a geographically larger Poland, larger than today's geographical Poland, that is. In turn, Poland was ruled by a feudal-style monarchy formed in the 1300 by a king called Casimir the Great. But after him, the king remained essentially a figurehead, and power was now all in the hands of the nobility, a bit like in Germany. Concurrently with this development, the peasants' position had deteriorated dramatically, and they who were actually free in the early Middle Ages, the peasants, were now essentially slaves. Masters held power of life and death over the enslaved peasants without appeal. Cheap labor, then as now, enabled the militaristic expansion of Poland towards the east, including Ukraine, where, in turn, the local Orthodox peasants were essentially reduced into slavery. And then as now, the local elites gladly changed allegiance and religion to ally themselves with the ruling Poles and enjoy the benefit of slavery over their peasants. Now, as a reaction to their conditions, the enslaved peasants held on to the Orthodox creed. And this is also the time when hatred of the Jews developed in the land which still today is called Ukraine. Apparently, from what we read in history, the ruling elites employed the Jews to supervise and control the enslaved peasants. And as you know, the junta that carried out the coup in Kiev in this February 2014 includes the right sector, which is strongly anti-Semitic. Now, Pope Clement VIII had enough, finally, of peasants. Peasants refused to be converted to Roman Catholicism. And if conditions were bad before for the peasants, they now became worse. And the instrument for the change in policy was called the Union of Brest. And this refers to the 1596 decision of the so-called Ruthenian Church of Rus, which was a branch of the Orthodox creed, to break relations with the Patriarch of Constantinople and to enter into communion, place itself under the authority of the Pope of Rome. And thus began a long period of vicious persecution of Orthodox peasantry, particularly vicious in the persecution of Orthodox Christian was a Mephistophelian character by the name of Joseph Kuntsevich. He was eventually lynched by a mob of peasants, but, wonder of wonders, he was buried in St. Peter Cathedral in Rome. And the Catholic Church called him a martyr for Christ, and he is still admired by today's Ukrainian, or revered by today's Ukrainian nationalists. The Poles have even erected the church with his name in, believe it or not, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And it was in this time, the beginning of the 1600s, that the entity of Ukraine, if not a nation, was created. We're now getting to the end of our episode, and we will reserve for the next episode the continuation of this sketch, of the historical sketch of Ukraine, which will then bring them hopefully to the present, or at least to the near present. I will thank the crew, in particular Kat Arvidsson, our director, and I will see you next time. Also remind you that the episodes of the historical sketches are also uploaded online on the website www.yourdailysshakespeare.com, where you can watch them if you wish, at any time at your leisure. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Good night from Historical Sketches. This is Jimmy.